Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and as a member of an alumnus of this committee's staff, it's again a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I want to begin with a comment on this question of independence, which has been touched on repeatedly. Vice Chairman Cohn said, and I think with very carefully chosen words, that the Congress granted a substantial degree of independence to the Federal Reserve. That independence is, of course, independence from the executive branch. It is not and cannot be independence from the Congress itself. The Federal Reserve may be delegated certain functions by the Congress, but the Congress can always choose to hold it accountable, and this committee, of course, has the responsibility of oversight precisely for that reason. So I think we should be very clear that when speaking of the independence of the Federal Reserve, it's a legal independence of a kind that other regulatory institutions have had over the course of our history. It is not an independence which is specific to monetary policy per se. The question before us is whether the Federal Reserve is the best agency to take on the responsibility for regulating systemic risk. And I have some reservations about that, and I would classify them in three broad categories. The first one might call constitutional, and I would pick up a point that was already made this afternoon by Congressman Sherman. It concerns the fact that the Federal Reserve is constituted in part of regional Federal Reserve district banks who have boards of directors who are formed from the member banks themselves. And it's, of course, true that the district banks are represented on the Federal Open Market Committee with a voting power whose constitutionality, incidentally, was challenged in court by the chairman of this committee back in the 1970s when I was serving here on the staff. The issue was never resolved on the legal merits. It's also the case, as I understand it, that the examiners under a systemic risk supervision regime would actually reside in the district banks rather than at the Federal Reserve Board. And it seems to me this does raise a question at least of perception. That is to say, whether it is appropriate to have systemic risk regulators who are part of institutions that report in part and accountable in part to boards of directors consisting in part of the member banks of those institutions. For two reasons. One, there may be a systematic conflict between the interests of the member banks and the interests of system stability. And secondly, there may be conflicts between the interests of member banks and the interests of other Tier 1 financial holding companies who are not member banks. So it seems to me that is at least a question which is worth considering as you think about the architecture of this particular system. The second concern that I would have is institutional. It is whether in an agency whose primary functions are macroeconomic, one would ever have a commitment to the systemic risk regulation, to the supervisory responsibilities that is commensurate with the importance of that particular function. It seems to me worth pointing out that there is in the Treasury proposal basically a two-stage process. One of which is analytical, and the other one is has more of an enforcement character. The analytical question is to determine what is a systemically dangerous institution to be classified as a Tier 1 financial holding company. That, it seems to me, would be an appropriate function to vest in the Federal Reserve Board, where an office that is incremental in the sense that Vice Chairman Cohn stipulated could decide amongst the relatively small number of large institutions who is and who is not in that category. The enforcement, the supervision, the regulation of the behavior of the institutions, it seems to me, naturally would be more appropriately placed in an agency for whom that is the primary priority, an agency such as the FDIC. The third concern that I have is a question of the leadership of the Federal Reserve. Historically, this is the chairmanship of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve is an extremely high-profile appointment. It's an individual who tends to be close to and to need the confidence of the financial markets. And there is a real question as to whether there is any record in the history of the Federal Reserve of effective response to systemic risk in advance of crisis. This was not the case. Benjamin Strong in the 1920s, who was the leading figure at the time, although not the chairman of the board. It was not the case of Alan Greenspan in the run-up to the latest crisis. We had a doctrine which, in effect, denied that systemic risk could, in fact, bring down the system. That doctrine was articulated at the peak of the Federal Reserve, and it seems to me that we had a test of that proposition, and it came up wanting. So it does seem to me that there are reasons to be worried about vesting the authority for systemic risk in the Federal Reserve. Thank you very much.
I thank you for your testimony, and Dr. Berner, you're recognized.